Welcome, everyone. As we begin, I would like to request everyone to keep their mics on mute. I think I can hear an echo, Swati. Am I coming across okay? Okay, thanks. And you may keep your videos switched off, except if you are a discussant or an author, or if you're making an intervention. So on behalf of the Junior Faculty Forum for South Asian Law Teachers, let me welcome you to our 10th paper workshop. My name is Dinesha Samararatne. I'm one of the advisors of the JFF, and I'm currently a senior lecturer at the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. There are two other advisors to JFF, and they are Professor Tarunabh Khaitan and Swati Javeri. Tarun is an apology for tonight. And all the logistics and the program management for the JFF are run by our able co-conveners, Tavini Nanakara, Swati Singh Parma, and Animesh. Animesh is also an apology for today. So today, we will be considering the paper titled Place of the Mughal Empire Within the Family of Nations by Aman Kumar. But before we get to the formalities of our workshop, we would like to begin our proceedings for the evening by acknowledging the catastrophe that particularly the people of India are experiencing as we speak. As we speak, people impacted by the pandemic in India are suffering in numerous ways, and many are doing the best they can to help save lives and care for their neighbor, often taking risks to their own lives. We would also like to acknowledge that beyond India, shackled by economic, political inequalities, people are struggling due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to further acknowledge that crises that go beyond the COVID-19 pandemic restrain humanity and our world from flourishing. I would also like to invite Swati Javeri to speak to this before we move on to the next stage of our workshop. Swati.
Thanks, Dinesha. So yeah, just to echo everything Dinesha said, we're just very sorry that the region's going through the difficulties that it's going through now. We really appreciate everyone being here to support Aman as we discuss his paper. So just really acknowledging the difficulties everyone is going through, and yeah, really appreciate you being here. So without sort of taking up too much time for everybody, because we know you're just so busy and you must have your hands full, we'll turn over to Aman to your paper for a discussion.
Thank you, Swati. So the JFF was founded to provide a platform, particularly to early career scholars working in and on South Asia, in the field of law, broadly speaking, to workshop their work in progress. To that end, we convene once a month to discuss a draft paper with the aim of providing constructive feedback for the author and to cultivate a sense of community beyond our political borders. So to begin that exercise, let me introduce our author and our discussants. So our author is Aman Kumar, joining us from Bangalore. Aman Kumar is assistant professor at the Faculty of Law of the Institute of Financial and International Management in Bangalore, where he teaches, among other subjects, public international law. Aman is a graduate of the National Law University of Assam and of the South Asian University. This paper reflects his current research interest, which is in the area of decolonizing international law. And we are, I must say, delighted to have with us two discussants who have contributed to the growing body of literature on the decolonization of international law. We have with us Professor Antony Anghie, who is presently at National University of Singapore, He's also the Secretary General of the Asian Society of International Law. And many of us are familiar with his path-breaking book published in 2005, Imperialism, Sovereignty, and the Making of International Law. And I think it's also important to mention that Tony has been a wonderful colleague to know and has always been a source of support to any colleague who has reached out to him. So thank you, Tony, for making the time to be with us today. Second, we also have another wonderful discussant with us, Professor Sundhya Pahuja, who's from Melbourne Law School. She's the director of the Institute for International Law and the Humanities. She's also, among other things, Director of Studies for International Law and Development at the Melbourne Law School. Sundhya has authored in 2011 the book Decolonizing International Law, Development, Economic Growth, and the Politics of Universality. So really, we can't think of two better people to discuss Aman's paper today. So how we will proceed is as follows. I will invite Tony to first speak 10 to 15 minutes to Aman's paper, and that will be followed by Sundhya, who will also speak 10 to 15 minutes. And we will invite Aman to respond if he wants to, but I think we generally encourage the author to collect as much feedback as possible. So we are happy to open the forum for discussion as soon as possible. And our discussion and workshop will finish in 1.5 hours. So over to you, Tony. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dinesha. And let me say that I'm very honored to have been invited to speak on this occasion in relation to Aman's very interesting paper. And I just want to echo the sentiments that all of you have expressed about the situation. It's very humbling and really a bit surreal to be engaged in this sort of exercise where in such a difficult situation. And I don't think we can claim like the IPL. I think the IPL said that the IPL continues in the name of humanity. So cricket has to continue in the name of humanity. I'm not sure whether we can make such an extravagant claim ourselves, but we are continuing. And let me just thank everyone for taking the time to be with us on this occasion, in this particular community, in these difficult circumstances. Aman, thanks very much for your paper. I suppose I'll just begin with a few obvious comments, which is the first comment I would make is, just trying to work out what the overall argument of your paper is. So it is presented in a fairly general way, and I took it to be a paper which is about the process of tracing the changing status of the Mughal Empire, while also trying to understand that changing status in the context of changes taking place within this thing called international law, at a time when a change was taking place from the so-called naturalist world of international law to the positivist world of international law. So it's a somewhat difficult exercise in a way to trace, what's happening within the Mughal Empire, and then also to trace what's happening, you could say, in the larger context and how these two levels intersect with each other in that regard. So I thought perhaps my comments might be made more precise by actually focusing on some of the language that you use in your paper. So it was interesting. I think I got the correct version of the paper because I think that I suddenly had this nervous moment about half an hour ago when I wondered, is there a new version of the paper from the one which I had looked at and downloaded some weeks ago? So I might be commenting on the wrong paper. I hope that's not the case. But I noticed, for example, in the SSRN abstract that you provided, that it seemed that you had somewhat shifted your argument, in the sense that I got the impression that you were trying to make a general argument, which is expressed in your title, the place of the Mughal Empire within the family of nations. That's a fairly broad term. And then you are talking in your abstract, you seem to focus more particularly on, what happened immediately before the status of the Mughal Empire at a time of its decline, before it actually, got to a stage where, Victoria proclaimed herself sovereign over India. So that was a more limited claim that you were making. So this suggested to me that you two are still in the process of thinking about what exactly your focus should be from within this broader context to a more specific argument. So then I thought I'll make a few comments based on your actual on the actual language in this version of the paper, which I hope is the version that you have. For example, this is at page 2, the second paragraph. Therefore, this paper will discuss the place of the Mughal Empire in India and whether or not Mughals had sovereignty over India. So here I think that sentence raises quite a lot of issues, which I think it might be worthwhile unpacking. The place of the Mughal Empire in India, and you do provide a fairly extensive history of the Mughal Empire in India, the Marathas, Shivaji, Akbar, all the major characters and the fluctuations in the status of the Mughal Empire. But what I felt about that history was, and it goes back to the sentence as well, whether or not the Mughals had sovereignty over India. I'm just wondering whose version of sovereignty you had in mind. So are you thinking of sovereignty in terms of the existing, you could say, Western jurisprudence of sovereignty? You mentioned Grotius and Vattel and so forth. Are you thinking of them? Or could it be said that, Indian sovereignty had, or Mughal sovereignty had its own characteristics, had its own structure, had its own concepts. And there are times when you mention these concepts. So, you mentioned the concepts of, I never get the word right, but suzerainty is a term that crops up from time to time in your paper. I mean, I can see, I think Prabhakar, I think I saw Prabhakar here somewhere, but Prabhakar is working on this theme of semi-colonialism and suzerainty. So I'm just wondering, when you provide that history of the Mughal Empire, I wonder whether you could anchor it to some kind of conceptual argument. In other words, rather than say this happened and then Shivaji became more powerful, and then Shivaji became less powerful, and then there were these complications, and then at one time there was a relationship between the two, then it broke up. It seems that it's one event after another. And of course, I think in the history boys, there's this line, what is history? It's one damn thing after another. So I suppose it's that version of history. Actually, I censored the history boys version of that particular phrase. But I'm wondering whether you can use that historical material to say, I'm studying this historical material in order to provide a conceptual argument about the character of Mughal rule or about the character of Mughal sovereignty as they understood it. Does that make sense? So it goes back to that sentence, the paper will discuss the place of the Mughal Empire in India and whether or not the Mughals had sovereignty over India. And, we should make a distinction between sovereignty as it is, recognized by the West at this time and all the different ways in which they seem to recognize in their language Mughal sovereignty and what was happening within the Mughal Empire. And you do at times in the paper seem to acknowledge these two different levels. But I think it might be made more explicit, and the history part could be elucidated or made a part of maybe studying precisely this issue of Mughal sovereignty, whatever it is that could be said about it, because I don't know enough to talk about it. But I think that's one of the issues that we face as 12 scholars. Do we really understand this history well enough? And what is the language in which we try to represent this history? The whole question about, Siam and sovereignty, Tongchai Wanishkul's work, a different understanding of sovereignty, and it presents a sort of contrast perhaps with the Western concept of sovereignty. So then, the next sentence, it will also explore how the concept of sovereignty heralded an era of the European law of nations and how the idea itself was rooted in the distinction between societies based on culture. So here you focus now on the other dimension, which is more explicitly on the international law dimension. And here again, you mentioned the concept of sovereignty, herald an era. So again, I think what might be useful here is to unpack it a little. The concept of sovereignty herald, whose concept of sovereignty heralded a new era, and then how this particular concept of sovereignty did embody a distinction between the civilized and uncivilized, which then had these effects. So, so those are just some sort of preliminary comments, because I think the first thing that readers would look to is a clear argument, and it seems that you've got a lot of interesting arguments, but the suggestion, and it's a somewhat cliched suggestion, is what is your argument? What is the structure of your argument? What are the concepts that you're using for those purposes in this regard? So. So the other interesting thing to me is that if we look at these dual levels, it seems that there's this interesting moment where it seems the Mughal Empire has lost power and still in some way persists. And there seems to be, as I understand it, a sort of a whole set of relationships which still appear to be maintained, where there's a kind of symbolic sovereignty of the Mughal Empire that continues on, even though the Mughals, Shah Alam has in effect lost power. And this is a moment of great confusion, which I think is fascinating. All the different ideas that are going on here. And I think, according to Alexandrovich, this presented a problem to the British. The British weren't sure whether to prop up the Mughal Empire so that there seemed to be some clear authority in place. That's Alexandrovich's argument about, some English officials who had that sort of a concept, or whether it was, a question of being more explicit about conquest in some respect. So I think it's a very interesting moment, and I don't know quite what you want to say about that, but it seems to me that that's a lot is going on here, and perhaps once again unpacking all the things that are going on there would be really interesting. You seem to have the idea that if naturalism had prevailed, and this of course is Alexandrovich's idea, if naturalism had prevailed, then Mughal sovereignty would have been recognized for a longer period of time, perhaps even all the way up to 1858. But I just want to, and this is an argument I make, I suppose, that naturalism itself is a jurisprudence of conquest. And so I'm not quite sure, even if naturalism was applied in these circumstances, given the decline of the Mughal Empire, what it is that naturalism could have salvaged, if that in fact was the use to which naturalism was being put. So in other words, again, this is just my tendency to sort of depart from Alexandrovich in this regard. This idea that naturalism would have in some way preserved the rights of non-European societies for a longer time. In these particular circumstances, in the context of the Mughal Empire, I'm not sure what work naturalism would have done. And in any case, I think naturalism has its own logic of conquest and a transfer of sovereignty in that regard. So those were some of the comments I had to make. I must say that the interesting thing that was going on here was this idea of suzerainty and how that worked in the Mughal Empire. That to me was something that I found very interesting. Let me just say in closing a few things about you could say about style. So the question that I think the demanding question asked of all of us as authors, the demanding question is, what is your take? What is it that you're contributing? What is it that you're saying that is different or that is new? So Aman, I really appreciate your engagement with my work. Let me also say, I think we've got to marginalize Antony Anghie. In other words, he's one more author, and you're finding your voice. In other words, Alexandrovich, Anand, all the A's, Alexandrovich, Anand, Anghie, okay. This is their take. And of course, it's only proper to acknowledge, whatever it is that we might learn from all scholars. I mean, that's, you could say, the appropriate way to proceed. But then I think what I would ask you to do is distinguish yourself. Say, this is their take. Here's my take. And, they have useful things to say, I'm sure, and, et cetera, et cetera. But then find your position, assert your position, and say, this is what I think is important here, and which has not been said. So it might be something about suzerainty, for instance, and about that concept and how that could be played out. But here, it's going back to some fairly basic things, which might be issues or elements that have been discussed in the previous seminars. What is your argument? How is it different? And and make that distinction between here's the existing scholarship, here's what I have to say that is different. And I feel it's only now, I shouldn't say only now, but we are living in a moment of this extraordinary proliferation of work, in terms of history. I certainly can't keep up with it, with all the work that is being done in so many fields: intellectual history, global history, all the variations thereof, and all the work that is being done, all the books that could be cited. I suppose one interesting possibility is for you to try and find some new materials, or look at particular materials in a bit more detail. It might be it might be a case of looking at some cases involving the East India Company, for instance. I'm not quite sure. I think people have been working on this, and of course, there's the book on the company state, Philip Stein's book, and all the rest of it. But in other words, what I would suggest is try to find some specific material which will provide you with the raw materials by which you can make a detailed argument, as opposed to a more general argument based on history, which seems to be the case now, if that makes sense. In other words, find some sort of, it might even be a case or a case study where these conceptual issues that I think is at the heart, in a way, of your interest can come through. So in this context, it might be useful to look at, there's a recent article published in the Asian Journal of International Law about China and suzerainty. I'll try and find the link, while Sandhya makes her comments, but I'll find the link. And it just provides, it's almost a fascinating, a kind of comparative study of suzerainty. What was the case in China? What was the case in India? I think that would be fascinating. And it links up then with, all this other scholarship being done on semi-colonialism and so forth. But that article might provide a sort of also a model in terms of, issues to raise, material to look at, to then provide a foundation for, a very promising project, which I found fascinating, and I'm delighted to comment on. So thanks again, Aman.
Thank you very much, Tony. Sandhya?
Thank you. Thank you, Aman, for letting us read this paper. It's always difficult to share work that isn't finished and polished, and I'm always surprised by, in my own work too, how much goes from draft at a particular moment to a finished product. There's always a huge amount of difference. And so I don't really know at what stage this piece of work is at, but it's very promising. And I share some of Tony's thoughts, but let me just tell you a little bit about what I thought you were doing so far. So in descriptive terms, I think there's the impetus that I see driving the paper is a normative impetus to tell a story about a shift from equality to inequality of a Mughal empire in the family of nations, so to speak. And I think that the way that you try to do that, the way you try to scratch that political itch, if you like, is to try to understand the political position of the Mughal Empire before colonialism and track that political position against the emergence of a particular kind of international law in the 19th century. And you situate that in another kind of international law that exists before the 19th century, which we could call the law of nations, but it shifts around a little bit in the paper at the moment. And so what you do to make that argument or follow that intuition, because I agree with Tony that the argument itself is not clear, but I'll come to that in a second. So what you try to do is you try to say that the Mughal Empire was a sovereign before the 19th century, and that's where I see the historical sequence of events part of the paper sitting. So that's what you could call a de facto characterization. And you want to show that they were de facto sovereigns as against other empires like the Marathas, or and that they were also de jure sovereigns as against other claimants to authority within India. And I think there's a question about what you mean by India. And then you want to say de jure, they were also sovereigns under this law of nations. And then you shift to the 19th century and you say, with the 19th century, that sovereignty was no longer recognized, and that the empire, the Mughal Empire, lost its status because of a change in international law from natural law or the law of nations to positivism. And somewhere in that shift of status, it became a colony. And I think there's a slightly complicated thing that needs to be unpacked in terms of the power relationship between status in international law and status as a colony. So that's sort of how I see the pieces of the article being presented at the moment. And I think that for me, what is potentially extremely interesting and original about this contribution is that it is potentially a corrective to a Eurocentric idea of international law. So your driver is the question of the shift from equality to inequality for the Mughal Empire. But underneath that story is also a story of a shift from one kind of international law to another. And it's a pre-19th century to a post-19th century. Now, I agree with Tony's characterization. So if that's where I see the genius of the contribution lying, then what could you work on substantively to take this to the next level? So I agree with Tony that when we write like this, we're trapped. We have to find a way to deal with the hegemony of European concepts and the fact that those European concepts were not universal retrospectively, except that we look back from now and we cast them backwards as though they were. And so one of the things that I think is going on is that you are taking Alexandrovich's account of the law of nations and possibly unifying it too much, because a different way of understanding what Alexandrovich was describing, because remember that he's describing from his position in 1950s, Cold War, wherever he was in his various places. So one of the things that he's describing is a situation of plurality. And that plurality is a plurality arguably of international laws. And so I think one of the things that you're finding it difficult to hold on to is actually you have put your finger on a set of plural international laws, but by sticking too closely to Alexandrovich, Alexandrovich is really important, so you shouldn't abandon him, but people have been writing since then to say, well, how can we understand the situation before the 19th century? And so I think that's where I would say go beyond Anghie, although Anghie made the field different. I think people have written since Tony where they've tried to pluralize international law itself, particularly before the 19th century. And so I think that could be something, a really interesting thing for you to tease out, to say, well, is it actually fitting to use a language of sovereignty, or am I trying to describe a configuration of political authority to give oneself the law that exceeds the European conception of sovereignty, or that doesn't fit? So in other words, the idea that what we do when we look back is find that they were, quote unquote, really sovereign, is actually doing a disservice to the plurality of forms of political authority and associational life that existed. So I would probably say, if those are the things that you could work on substantively, that the way that you could structurally address this is to say, potentially start with the part that you currently call, it's mislabeled 2.2 in my copy, but it's probably 2.3, which is the recognition of Mughal sovereignty in India. And I'd probably start with that, or I'd potentially think about starting with that, to say that the Mughal Empire was a large centralized authority. I don't know if I'd call it a state even, because I would be wary of carrying terminology backwards that doesn't quite fit, and say it was this centralized power, and it changed in status radically from the perspective of Europe. So be really attentive to the question of perspective from the pre to the post 19th century. And you're going to track that shift. And so I think you could then reorganize some of the historical material and put it a bit later. So as Tony said, it's organized around a conceptual and theoretical inquiry. Because I think that the practical point of leading with the history, as it were, is partly the idea of presenting a reader with a succession of facts without the reader really knowing where you're going, but also because I'm assuming you're a law scholar, a legal scholar, and not a historian, that the originality of the contribution is never going to be the primary historical research. It's always going to be the jurisprudential interpretation of historical stuff that is drawn from secondary literatures. And I mean, I think that's fantastic, and it's not at all a criticism to say that, and I do it all the time myself, to rely on good quality histories that others have written. But the thing that we bring to that is the jurisprudential inflection, and therefore you have to put that at the front so that you subordinate the stuff that you're relying on to the originality of your argument, because then it becomes a reinterpretation of existing things, which is a perfectly legitimate thing for you to do, but you don't want to put that stuff first because that's not the original stuff, if you know what I mean. So you subordinate it in structural terms. I think probably the one way to help yourself restructure the paper so that you are able to make it do what you want to do, but also make it do what you think it's doing, is to ask yourself these 5 questions that I always ask my people who I'm reading their work in whatever context they are. And those are the questions of context, question, object, orientation, and significance. So the context sets the frame for the reader. The context is like a frame a frame of a picture, literally, which is both inside and outside the picture. So you tell the reader what is important about the thing that you're going to tell them by situating that thing in the debate you want to situate it in. So are you situating this in a debate about international legal theory? Are you situating it in a debate about the critique of Eurocentrism? Are you situating it in a conversation about the Mughals? That's the opportunity to make that clear, because the reader will then assess what you tell us based on how you've set it up. So ask yourself, what is the intellectual context in which I'm intervening? And then say, what is the research question I'm answering? And you don't present it as a question, you present it as an argument. And then you say, what is the thing that I'm going to examine to show you this? And that would be that in so far, I think that's the transformations in the status and political authority of the Mughal Empire. And then you say, what's the orientation I'm going to bring to bear on that? And that's the methodology. So you're not a primary historian, you are a jurisprudent or international jurisprudent, if you like, or whatever name you want to give yourself, where you explain that what you're doing is bringing an interpretation to a set of historical materials that already exist. Because what you want to do is ask a question which challenges the habitual Eurocentric interpretation of all forms of non-European political authority. And you want to think about the implications of that challenge. And then you say, this matters because, and then that's the significance that may be about, it's a piece of the understanding in how non-white or non-European countries seem to have gone from a position of relative equality of recognition, if not equality of anything else, to an utterly subordinated status of objects of intervention over and over again. So I think if you ask yourself those questions methodically, you'll be able to align the pieces so that you do what you want it to do, and also find the sites where you need to do more, where you need to develop your thinking and research more to help yourself progress the project. I think I should probably stop there. I've probably spoken for too long, but it's a very, very promising project. So don't give up and transcend Tony Anghie.
Thank you so much, Sandhya. My role is chair today, but I've been taking notes for myself, listening to both of you. It's really, both of us have given us much ideas for thought. Apologies. Speaking specifically to Aman's draft work, but also more broadly about how we should be thinking about our own work, but also comment on others' work. So thank you very much. Aman, if you want to respond, you may, and I can give you a few minutes to do so. Otherwise, we can open up the floor for discussion.
Yeah, I just quickly want to contextualize the research in just 2 minutes. So
yes.
The way I approached the reason why I came to talk about the sovereignty of Mughal Empire was because I was looking at, first of all, the trial of the last Mughal emperor, that was Bahadur Shah Zafar, in the year 1858. So and that research itself was motivated because of the ongoing debates about the immunity of head of states under international criminal law. So from that, I approached trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar, that was in 1858, where it was argued that Bahadur Shah Zafar in 1858, who was the then Mughal emperor, it was argued at his trial that he was a British subject. He was tried as a British subject. So that was the whole, that's how this entire argument about looking for a place or looking for sovereignty of Mughal Empire within Law of Nations came from, and that's how I started researching on this aspect. So this research paper was actually the second chapter of my dissertation, which I wrote for my master's thesis, which was about the trial of Mughal emperor. So yeah, just wanted to give a context for this research.
Thank you, Aman. That's helpful. So now we will open up for comments and questions, and how we would like to proceed is I would like you to please raise your virtual hand, and I will maintain a list. And depending on how many comments or questions we have at a given time, I will collect a few and then come back to either Aman or even Tony or Sandhya, as the case may be. So the floor is now open. Yes, Mohd Imran, you may make your comment or question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. It was, I read Paper Aman sir last night, and it is really good. And I think, thank you, Professor Anghie and Professor Pahuja, for nice comments. Sir, I have just suggestions, not a question, that while you are writing on the sovereignty of the Mughal Empire, you have not included the opinion of Islamic scholars of Mughal period or the Sultanate period. I would like to suggest if you can add Ziauddin Barni and Abul Fazl's opinion. I mean, how Mughals saw themselves. I mean, how the Mughal scholars saw themselves as a sovereign state or whatever. And the second suggestion, if it comes within the scope of your paper, Humayun, I think Humayun had accepted the caliphate system during his region, and Akbar for most part of his life also accepted the position of caliphate, and caliph was the the king of the whole Islamic world for that time, and that was the Ottoman Empire. So how do you see the relation of Mughal and the Ottoman Empire for that particular period of time? Does it affect the sovereignty of Mughal Empire for certain period of time, or it is the same? So these are just two comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Arvind, I have you next, followed by Swati Javed.
Thank you. Am I audible now? Perfect. Right. I should begin by saying I'm not an international lawyer, but I am a legal historian, and I do work specifically on the period you're covering, looking at colonialism and the way in which people both in South Asia and in Britain thought about the relationship between empire and colony. So my comments are coming from that perspective. The first point is, I mean, I see two different things going on in your paper, and this goes more to speak to your broader project than to this specific paper. The first is looking at shifting ways in which the British saw the capacity or capability or status of their interlocutors in South Asia, and moving from a position where they saw them as equals to where they saw them as subjects. So that's one thing that's going on. The second thing that's going on is in relation to the way the Mughal world saw itself. What conception of themselves did they have? What was their underpinning? What was the Mughal constitution, and what sort of entity was the Mughal state in its constitution? So that's the other thing that's going on. These are both really interesting topics. On the first, I think I'd strongly suggest you look more closely at John Selden, because I think Selden's views on international law were firstly formulated in opposition to Grotius, and secondly, embed within them a proto-positivism. Specifically, he goes away from, he specifically rejects the notion of right reason and looks much more to custom and history, and particularly the history of civilized and noble nations, the history of their practices as underpinning international law, or what passes for it. I think that's a very, he was influential in the way in which 18th century Englishmen thought about law. So and there's a lot of what you say in the way in which they dealt with the Mughal Empire that certainly reminded me very much of the way in which Selden worked. It's worth pointing out another person from that period, Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was a very, very strong proponent of the view that the Indian states were equal, they were civilized. He had this famous map where he showed you, look, they have irrigation canals, they have roads, they have bridges. This could almost be an English county. But the point to make is by the late 18th century, Burke was already on the losing side, and you already see a strong shift in the way in which the dominant powers, the dominant line of opinion in England is thinking about its relationship with the colonies. So in the point of view, I think looking at some of those debates would be very, very productive in adding more nuance to your account of what Austinian positivism did and where it was coming from. The second comment I'd make relates to the way in which you look at Mughal constitutionalism. I think the points that Sundhya and Tony made are absolutely spot on. Is sovereignty the right way and stated the right way of thinking about the Mughal world? I just want to give you one example. I appreciate I'm talking a lot and I'll shut up very soon. But I just want to give you one example focusing on the south of India. Now, in the 18th century in the south of India, you had the Nawabs of the Arcot, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and the Mughal Empire. The Nizam of Hyderabad was ostensibly under the Mughal crown, and the Nawab of the Arcot was ostensibly under the Nizam of Hyderabad, but they were at all times in rebellion against each other and behaving in ways that were inconsistent with central claims to authority. So basically, if you think of the south of India, you had the Nawab, who was a rebel against the Nizam, who was a rebel against the Mughal crown. And if you then look at the things they try, in the way in which they try to legitimate their status as rebels, you start seeing really interesting things. So the Muhammad Ali as Nawab of the Arcot, Nawab of the Carnatic, was drawing very strongly on pre-Mughal ideas of legitimacy, particularly the idea of legitimacy coming from religious acts and religious patronage and derived from religious powers. He held these great ceremonies at Sri Rangam at the temple of Vishnu, and he also patronized the Kalandariya Sufi orders of the Tamil country. So there's some real complexities and nuances, and you had the people who were in rebellion against the Nawab, the Polygars or the Parekaras, who were themselves claiming legitimacy by succession from Vijayanagar and other such. So there are these real complexities in relation to the way sovereignty or whatever passes for it, stated legitimacy and rule are being conceptualized. And I think roping into some of that, if you, not for this paper, it's way too complex, but in your broader project of decolonizing international law from an Indian perspective, I think examining some of these complexities will probably be really productive in the medium to long term. Yeah, that's it from me.
Thanks, Aravind. Before we get to Swati, Aman, would you like to respond, or do you have any questions or clarifications?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment. I mean, Arvind was a lot of suggestions. So I've noted on the suggestion, there was not particularly any question, but his suggestions were very useful, will be very useful. Regarding Imran's comment, I think the comments were generally regarding the difference between culture, which in future is going to be a very important aspect of my project, because what we see is ignorance of Mughal court practices. So Mughal court practices in the sense that, for example, when we talk about how the very inception, the very beginning of this relationship between Britain and Mughal Empire, through Sir Thomas Roe, when Sir Thomas Roe comes to Jahangir's court, he comes with a treaty, a well-written treaty, and comes with that treaty to the court. But rather than signing that treaty and making it an official document, what the Mughal Empire does is Mughal Emperor issues a farman. Now, farman is a Persian term. Now, how this farman is different from a treaty? For all practical purposes, there is no such difference. He issues a farman, and by showing that farman, by virtue of that farman, the East India Company is now given this permission to trade in India. For that very same purpose, Sir Thomas Roe had a treaty, but the Mughal Emperor, rather than signing the treaty, issued this farman. So there is a subtle difference between cultural practices between the East and the West, where one needs to highlight, I mean, I need to highlight in my research the importance of a farman, because this farman again becomes contentious, because at the Zafar trial in 1858, the British argued that in 1803, by issuing a farman, Shah Alam had ceded his sovereignty, meaning thereby that Mughals had ceded their sovereignty to the East India Company by virtue of this farman itself. So I have not elaborated on this concept of farman in this paper, but in future, I think in the larger project, I'll be talking about the importance of farman, and that's how the difference between cultural practices of East and the West and the cultural practices of British king and the Mughal emperor needs to be highlighted a bit more. And regarding this aspect about Humayun, or later on Akbar, being the ruler of the Islamic world, the similar arguments were raised in 1858 also, where it was said that when the revolt had actually begun in Delhi, the argument in 1858 was that somebody from Persia is coming to help the Mughal Empire defeat the East India Company, because at that point of time, the Mughal Emperor was considered to be under the Persian Empire in the Islamic hierarchy of power. So yeah, Imran's suggestion, I'll obviously be talking about those suggestions in the larger project on this.
Thank you, Aman. Swati?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dinesha. So I had 6 questions to start with, and then after Tony and Sandhya's comments, I'm left with 1 question, because they've covered everything incredibly well. I just want to kind of pick up on some of the things, Aman, that Tony and Sundhya mentioned. One is sort of figuring out your overall argument that you're going to be making. And, Sundhya gave you this incredible structure, which I've noted down as well for thinking about this. So context, question, object, orientation, and significance. With each of those questions, what you might want to ask yourself is, who do you want your audience to be? So who is your readership going to be? And I can think of sort of three groups of readers in particular who would be interested in your paper. So one is the legal historians, and Arvind, clearly you've piqued his interest. The other is intellectual sort of historians. So especially in the international law space, those who are just interested in sort of movements in the intellectual history relating to international law. And the third is international law theorists or conceptualizers. So you've got three potential audiences available to you when you're kind of crafting your paper. And it's good to have your readership in mind, in particular, because it might help you with the pitch of your paper at various points. So Sundhya and Tony both mentioned the historical descriptive work you've got going on in the paper and the periodization of the events that you're talking about. So if you're kind of looking at it from a historian's point of view, then they may not need as much descriptive work. Whereas if you're looking at an international law group, they might need a little bit more, but I want to come back to how you weave in some of the descriptive work when I pick up on the framework comments that Sundhya and Tony have already made to you. And I was kind of looking at section 3 of your paper, the beginning of section 3. Some of that content might be a little bit too simple for your international law crowd who are domain specialists. So again, once you have your audience in mind, it really helps you figure out what the pitch of your paper is going to be and the level of detail you need to go into for various sections. So that's my first comment. The second is, how do we depart from the Antony Anghies and the Sundhya Pahujas of the field? It's such a big ask to make of a scholar who's sort of crafting their research project, right? So some strategies to think about is the object of your paper. So going back to Sundhya's framework, this is sort of the third point in that framework, thinking about the object. I think that's a really good way of differentiating where you come into the field. So you've got a really interesting object for discussion. And what you can do with that object is use it to spotlight gaps or blind spots in existing literature in the field, and that's your takeoff point. So there are lots of different ways in which you can sort of lean on some of the work that's being done, because that's what we do, right? We have to engage with literature in our field, but we do want to have a unique voice as well. And I think your object is unique, and you might want to really fix on that as your takeoff point for departing from some of the literature. That's my second point. My third is, I am not an international law scholar, not a legal historian. I'm a public law sort of, that's my area. So my next comment comes from a very public law mindset. You have three big concepts that are animating your paper. One is sovereignty, then the second is political authority, and the third is political legitimacy. Now, as a public lawyer, we never interchange these three concepts. They're just so distinct. Now, as a public lawyer, we're looking at these three concepts internally within the state. So we're looking at sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy of the state vis-a-vis the citizens and other players within the state. You're obviously looking at these three concepts in terms of state versus other state, and I acknowledge the comments that have already been made about whether you want to look at state and bring in statehood, but I'm going to put that aside for a moment. And you're looking at the external sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy of the Mughal Empire against the other players in the field. But even though we're looking at these concepts differently, I'm looking at it internally, you're looking at it externally, I feel like there's so much work that it would be good to do in this so much more conceptual work that it would be really good to do on this. And I'm in the chat, I'm going to send a recent special issue that just came out. It's the International Theory Journal, and they're talking about authority legitimacy in the context of global governance. So it's this different context, but they have a lot of intellectual material there that you might want to hive and have a look at, specifically in sort of understanding authority legitimacy in your domain space, because it's not mine. Now this brings me back to the comment I was making about the descriptive work in your paper. I think I would almost like flip the paper on its head. So I feel like the first few sections of your paper need to be that conceptual work, and then you go into the history. And I think Sundhya's already done this, has mentioned this in a much, much more articulate way than I could ever attempt to do. So I'm just gonna cut, copy, paste what Sundhya said to you already on this. But I think flip the paper on its head, do the conceptual work first. And the work that I would really want to see done if I was reading this paper is those three things I mentioned. So sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy. In particular, distinguishing authority from legitimacy, because they really are asking, to me, even from a lay person's perspective, they're asking very different questions. Now your legitimacy might come from your authority, but then you're talking about a very sort of thin idea of legitimacy. I'm just kind of playing these concepts out in my head and how they might interlink with each other. But I really see that they are very different ideas. And there are three very big different ideas. So you might want to pick one to do the heavy lifting for your paper, in terms of the heavy conceptual lifting for your paper. But yeah, that's something I think needs a lot of thinking. Yeah, thanks, Aman.
Thank you, Swati. So the two messages that are loud and clear, or the feedback that's loud and clear for you, Aman, is to take on the theoretical challenge and let your voice be heard. That's a very positive invitation to you. Do we have any further comments, questions? You can also place your question or comment on the chat if you would prefer that.
Not, Dinesha, I have a couple of other things I wouldn't mind talking about, but I really don't want to take up a lot of bandwidth. Another voice might be good to listen to for a few minutes, and then I can come back in. Yeah.
Thank you, Swati. Let's see whether we have anyone else who wants to make an intervention. Okay, in that case, Aman, do you want to respond, or should we move on to Swati? I leave the choice with you.
You can take more comments from Swati.
Okay.
Can I say something?
Of course.
So one thing I was thinking, Aman, when you responded and you were talking about the Firman compared to the treaty, and you were speaking of them as different cultural practices, I wondered whether it would help you in provincializing the language of European international law to think of them more as rival legal practices, or you could think of them using a theoretical language of jurisdiction as rival ways that different kinds of polity were trying to engage in arrangements with each other. Because if you say that there's a Firman and there's a treaty, you actually can't measure one thing against another unless you purport to transcend those two particular legal forms. And so it may simply be helpful to you in in trying to unpick some of the language to say, well, these things were being affected through these legal forms, and these things were being affected by these legal forms. And when these people meet these people, they have a battle over whose legal form is going to take precedence. And after the 19th century, that increasingly became European legal forms. But until the 19th century, there was a plurality of legal forms, and that's why it's helpful both to not think of them simply as cultural, but also not to use the language of sovereignty and state, which are already terms that come from the victorious legal forms. So that might be helpful to tell a historically more thick story that doesn't carry contemporary legal terminology after the victory of the positivists, if you like, backwards before that victory. So even when John Austin was writing, I mean, it was interesting that you said his work gained fame after he died, but when he was writing, he was arguably writing not descriptive, but prefigurative work about the importance of positivism. And that was also about elevating the power of the state. So I think if you can try and imagine yourself back into the time before certain concepts gained ascendancy, that you might find it easier to describe more accurately what it is you're trying to describe. It's a very hard exercise, and we have to train ourselves out of it, because as lawyers, we're trained into thinking with the concepts that we use now, but trying to think about pluralizing and not imagining stuff backwards can be one trick to get your head in that place, so you can actually describe stuff before it all got displaced by European legal terminology. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. Actually, the difficulty which I'm facing right now is that the point of reference, the year of reference for me is 1858. So by 1858, everything is already European in the context of international law. Now, why I'm looking at 1858 is that in 1858, it was argued that the Mughal Emperor was actually a British subject, right? So then from 1858 point of view, I'm trying to look at this entire concept of sovereignty. So then that's why it's becoming difficult. For example, if I simply talk about 16th or 17th century, then I can use the language of farmans, and then I can use those language of Mughal court practices. But talking about the position of Mughal Empire, contesting the categorization of Zafar, the Mughal Emperor, as a British subject, from 1858 point of view, then becomes a bit difficult for me. So, I mean, Tony or Sundhya, anybody could suggest anything in that regard, that would be extremely helpful.
Okay, so I have Swati, then Arvind, and maybe perhaps I'll invite Tony to respond as well. Is that okay? In that order? Swati, Arvind, and then Tony.
I think I'll let Tony go first, because Aman specifically asked Tony a question. So yeah, I'll let Tony go first.
Well, that's very useful discussion. But actually, Aman, when you first mentioned that the reason you are looking at all this was because of this trial, I thought that's what you should start with. You know, that is the incident, that is the moment where all these issues, all these rivalries, the questions of which language to use, one system taking over another, all that is embodied in that trial, in that moment. And I think it would provide the reader with a sort of orientation to say, okay, here's the moment, and what you're going to do is unpack this and then see how this moment has come to be. And that might be a way of actually saying, actually, there was this other language. And, we have to try and recover that language. And then finally, in 1858, that might be this pivotal event where decisively, that other language is, completely subordinated, as represented by the fact that the Mughal Emperor is presented as a British subject. I mean, so I think you could build it up a lot, based on that event. Here, I'm thinking more of a kind of almost, in a way, our writing, there are stories, it's a drama, it's this character. And so I would begin with that and then see where I could go from there. But it seems to me that everything that we've been talked about could be seen as being somehow embodied in that moment. And what led to it.
Yeah, so actually, I've written a paper on the trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar. Hopefully, it will be out in the next issue of International Criminal Law Review by June or July. But I think what I need to do is I need to incorporate some of those arguments in the introduction part of this paper also.
Yes, I don't think there shouldn't be a bar on using the same event to see it from different perspectives, if you know what I mean. You know, I mean that's what we keep doing. We keep returning to history over and over again, isn't it? So I don't think I don't think that should be seen as a bar.
It will better contextualize this for present research. Yeah, so I'll do that. I'll do that.
Yep. Thank you both, Swati, and then Arvind.
Yeah, no, mine was actually very similar to what Tony and Sundhya are saying. So having said that there's a lot of conceptual work that needs to be done, I wonder if starting with a smaller event or a smaller scale context or object for discussion might be a better, more modest start to what is a pretty big project. So in that case, that really kind of imposes some kind of floor and ceiling on the amount of conceptual work they've done. But I'm not going to labor the point because they've mentioned it already. Just to say that, yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you, Swati. We have Arvind, and then we have Aditya Roy as well.
It's just picking up on the same theme. I think the issue you're raising, if your starting point is 1858, the trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar, how do you then bring in terminology that was and concepts that weren't used in 1858? That's one of the core challenges in history. But the answer to that is the question you're asking is how did we get to 1858 where everyone is thinking in these terms? And to do that, you need to start by understanding what the language was that fell away in the end of the 18th century. And if you start thinking about it in those terms, I would particularly urge you to look at transitional figures. I mean, Ram Mohan Roy is the most famous one because he was both the first westernized Indian, but also the last Mughal. I mean, it's not often known that he used to publish a paper in Persian for the Mughal inhabitants of Bengal. And he actually has a book written in Persian, very much in the Mughal tradition. But there were also other figures from that time who were notables in the Mughal world, navigating the transition to British rule. And looking at some of their work and the way in which they discuss British rule will give you a sense of it from the other end of the spectrum. How did the Mughals see this new world that was increasingly becoming their world? But that's how I encourage you to look at the challenge.
Thank you, Arvind. Aditya Roy. You still have your comment or question? Okay, maybe he'll come back to us then. So actually, usually we go on for 1.5 hours, but I think, Aditya, are you ready for your comment or question? Maybe we can't hear you. I can see the window light up, but I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
So Dinesha, while Aditya is sorting out the technical stuff, Aditya, if you can hear us, you can type your question in or send it to us, and we can forward it on to Aman. But yeah, Dinesha, I'll let you kind of conclude.
Yeah. So I think we've had a really rich discussion.
Hello.
Yes, Aditya, we can hear you. Sorry, Aditya, I think there is some technical glitch. So I would invite you to place your comment or question on the chat, or if you could email it to us, we'd be happy to share it with Aman. Thank you. So we would like to close early today because I think we've had a really good discussion and it's time to bring the discussion to a close. In fact, after we had scheduled the paper for discussion, some of us were wondering whether we should go ahead at all. But having had this discussion, I'm glad we did because we've had such strong engagement. And Aman, I hope you're happy with the excellent feedback on your paper and the engagement that we've seen today. And I want to thank all of you for taking time to be here and to contribute to this community effort. Thank you very much. I also want to thank Aman for boldly sharing your paper with us and for allowing us to discuss it and comment on it. Thank you very much, Aman. And as you revise this paper, I wish you good luck. Tony and Sandhya, thank you so much for responding so positively and engaging so enthusiastically and kindly. This is really refreshing, and I mean, it's hard to say this, but sometimes being able to focus your mind on an intellectual exercise can sometimes help to cope with everything else that one has to cope with these days. So thank you very much. We appreciate it very much. I also want to thank our co-conveners, Tavini, Swati, and Animesh for all the work you do continuously behind the scenes to make this possible. And I also want to thank Swati Javeri and Tarun for continuing to sustain the vision of JFF. I do think there is a lot of value in pursuing this exercise regularly. So thank you, everyone. And I wish you all well and stay safe. Next month, we are not meeting, but please look out for the announcement for the month after. Thank you very much and a good night.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Sandhya. Bye. Good night.
Thanks, Dinesha. This is great. I hope that you're okay.
I am. It's just as with everyone else, one is constantly shifting between difficult tasks.
Thanks, Aman. That was terrific. I really enjoyed